Yo, what's up everybody? It's Julius DeBerry with Majestic Studios, and today we got a video I'm very excited about. I had a question in one of my videos asking about some of my favorite keyboards or keyboards that I would suggest to other people. So I kind of want to do a spinoff and wanted to do a video telling you guys about my top favorite keyboards of all time. I'm only going to keep this confined to just Romplers though. Initially I was going to do a top 5, but I decided to do a top 3 instead. And then I have 2 honorable mentions. So I hope you guys enjoy this. Maybe you guys can also comment below and let me know what your favorite keyboards are of all time and even why. I'd love to read about them and see what you guys think. Hope you guys enjoy the video. Let's go. All right, so the first keyboard I want to bring up is going to be my first honorable mention, and it is the Korg Triton Classic. This keyboard goes way back with me, near and dear to my heart. Now, the reason this keyboard made my honorable mention list is because it was the first keyboard that I ever purchased. And when I say purchased, I mean the first keyboard I actually purchased. This was, my parents had bought me a rolling keyboard when I was growing up. That was my first, real keyboard. But this Triton was what I considered my first pro-am board, and I paid for it with my own money, brand new. My mom came and picked me up while I was in college, came and picked me up in Murfreesboro, went back to Jackson and went and got this keyboard from the music store there. I bought the Triton Pro X, which was the 88 key version of it. And it was just something that over the years I formed a great bond with. I think this might be the second longest tenured as far as keyboard that I owned. I don't own it anymore. I did sell it some years ago, probably about 10, 11 years ago I sold it. But it's definitely one of those boards that is near and dear to my heart. I guess you could say I kind of cut my teeth on it. That's where I got my start as far as synthesis is concerned and programming, using oscillators and the different parts of the Triton that help make up the sounds. Going in and digging into the keyboard, making drum kits and things like that. That's the first keyboard that I got my start on. It was also the second, but one of my favorite sequencers at that time, where I started learning how to build my own tracks. There was some buddies of mine, roommates in college, and we were all trying to get into music, and they were rapping, and maybe some people that were also singing, and that was the keyboard that we used to create a lot, or not, if not all, of the music that we were doing at that time. So we got to spend a lot of time with it, learning the ins and outs. But that keyboard is definitely on my list. I'll never forget it, and it was kind of how I got introduced. It is how I got introduced to Korg. But I'll always remember the Korg Triton, and that keyboard definitely belongs on the list of the my top keyboards of all time. So that's going to be my first honorable mention, the Korg Triton Classic, the Pro X version, which is the 88 key. Okay, now my second honorable mention keyboard is the Yamaha Motif XF. Now, this keyboard, it was on my list initially as number 4 in my top 5, but it was crazy because I could only really think of 2 reasons that I really liked it. And so I decided I didn't think that was worth allow it to get in my top list. But I did want to mention it because it did have a pretty influential part of my, as far as my keyboard life is concerned. And the reason why I bought the Motif XF is the first reason that I want to discuss. And I'll kind of come back to this later when I get into my top 3. But it was because of the pattern sequencer. At that point when I had this keyboard, when I decided to buy it, it was only myself, a bass player, and a drummer. And I wanted to do something to kind of make the sound more full, to give it like a full band aspect. And the Motif has this mode in it called the pattern mode. And that pattern mode allowed you to sequence sections of songs, like whether it be an intro, your verses, your chorus, and you could have them loop continuously and infinitely until you decided to tell it to go to another place in the song. So what I would do with this keyboard is I would go in, and this was before Ableton was really popular in church, as far as our church for sure. But before people were using Ableton for backing tracks and stuff like that, that allowed me to make backing tracks for us to utilize in church. So what I would do is I would track out the entire song from start to finish in sections. And then as the director of the choir told us where to go in the songs, I would just trigger that place within the song. So it allowed us to have, big full sections. I was on the organ, like I said, we had a bass player and a drummer, but I would program like strings and horns and synth parts and lead parts and piano parts all on the keyboard, and then have that we would play on top of to make our sound bigger. Made it sound like there was more people playing than there really was. So that was the main reason that I went out and got that keyboard, was because the pattern mode and the ability to use it like that in church. And the second thing that was a really favorite thing about this keyboard for me was the flash RAM. Being able to load up several gigabytes worth of samples and have them saved and burned into a flash card that you could insert in the keyboard, and then at any moment when you turn the keyboard on, those sounds are instantly there. There was no wait time, no load time. Now, it did take a while to burn the sounds into the flash drive initially, the flash chip initially, but once you got them in there, there wasn't something you ever had to worry about again. So having something like that ready to go, and like I said, several gigabytes worth of samples of sounds just ready to go at the drop of a hat. As soon as you turn the keyboard on, it's loaded. That was a really, really big deal. One thing that I will address at one point later is, like, when I was touring with Prince, that was one of the things that we utilized on his tour, was we had Motif XF keyboards. And so the fact that I already own this keyboard, that kind of opened the door and allowed me to, well, not allowed me, but it helped me a lot, because I already knew the ins and outs of that board tremendously well because of the time I had spent with it personally. So once I got on tour and got out there and saw that, oh man, that's all they're using is Motifs. Well, not all they're using, but the majority of the keyboards that were on that tour was Motif XFs. It was really easy for me. And there was a section of the shows where Prince would trigger samples during the show, and that's the keyboard that we were triggering those samples from. So just, I used to think about that. If anything went wrong during the show and that keyboard got shut down or the power went out, having to wait a long time for those samples to reload, because like I said, there was a lot of them. Like, his greatest hits were put all across the keys on the keyboard, and he would just trigger them during the shows. If anything ever happened where power went out and we had to reload that, it could take a long time. So the fact of having those flash RAM with those samples burned and loaded to those flash chips, where all we had to do was turn on the keyboard and the samples were ready to go, that was an awesome help for us. So that flash RAM is a pretty big deal. Yamaha was kind of cutting edge as far as that's concerned, and I think that's something that people have appreciated, because these days, especially in church, guys are all about samples and being able to load third-party sounds into their keyboard, and being able to turn that keyboard on and those sounds pop up immediately. That's a pretty big deal. So I did want to mention the XF. That is on honorable mention. It's not really in my top, it's not one of my top favorite keyboards, but it was very influential as far as when and why I started doing certain things with keyboards. And like I said, it also played a huge part in the touring days that I had with Prince and Cassandra O'Neal. So I did want to mention it because it is kind of important to me. So that's the second honorable mention, and now we're going to dive into my top 3 keyboards, my favorite Rompler based keyboards of all time. Almost forgot. The one thing that I did not like about the Motif XF was the fact that everybody had a Motif. As far as church is concerned, it's like if you didn't have a Motif, nobody even cared. But that's one of the most popular keyboards as far as church is concerned. They've been using those Motifs all the way back to the classic, the ES, the XF, and the XF. I mean, the classic, the ES, the XS, and the XF. So I kind of wanted to be different from everybody. I didn't want to really get super deep as far as that keyboard is concerned, because so many people had them. I wanted to have something a little different from everybody else, and like I said, it was a very popular keyboard, and rightfully so. Great sounds and great usability, and people were already familiar with the interface and how to use the keyboard, so that just allowed them to stay within their comfort zone, and that's understandable. So it was a very popular keyboard, but I wanted to learn as many as possible, and also wanted to be a little different. So I kind of veered more toward the Roland Phantom and the Korg side, and we'll hear about that in just a little bit. All right, so my number 3 favorite Rompler keyboard of all time is the Roland Phantom G. I have bought and sold this keyboard several times. I have owned the 88 key version, probably 3 or 4 times. I've owned the 7 version keyboard, which is the 76 key. I've owned that twice, and I've owned the 61 key version, probably 3 or 4 times as well. But I would always buy it and, you know, do what I needed to do. I never really kept it. And even now today, I kind of regret that I don't have one. But I have been looking into the new Phantom. And so it has some very unique features in it too that I think I'll love. I plan to get one soon, but the Phantom G is on my list there's 3 reasons that I want to discuss. The first reason is the ARX expansion cards. Now, in a day and age, I guess where stuff is now, we don't really see a lot of expansion cards going into keyboards, but Roland at this point, they had hardware expansion cards that you could buy and they would go into your keyboard. This was kind of a continuation of their SRX line. They had, I think, 12 different cards for that line. But the ARX line, I don't know if it got cut short or what happened, but they only ended up coming out with 3 cards. And the 3 cards were the electric piano card, the drum card, and then there was like a brass card for like live horns. The reason why I like those cards so much is because they came with their own polyphony. So if, you know, drums, horns, or EP were something that you really utilize a lot in your sequencing and in your playing, you could buy these cards and put them in the keyboard and it wouldn't count against the polyphony that were being used for other sounds. So that was a really good thing. My favorite of the 3 cards, though, was the drum card. And something that was really cool about these cards is they also came with their own mixer, as far as their sound mixer within the card itself. So, for example, with what are they called? With most keyboards, when you're sequencing, your sounds are on a track. So with your drums, let's say your drum track has several sounds and you want to change the volume of a single sound within that track, it's a little laborious to go into the keyboard in the programming and turn down the volume of a specific sample. Well, what was really cool about this ARX drum card was that within the mixer, all of the sounds within the drum kit you picked, they all popped up on individual tracks within the mixer. So if your kick was too loud, you could go in and turn the kick down with a mixer control, like with faders in the keyboard. And it made it really easy to go in and adjust specific elements like the kick drum, the snare drum, the toms, the hi-hat. You could go in and turn them up or down. And if I remember correctly, you could also apply effects to them individually too, but I'm not very sure. I don't remember that part exactly. But I do remember having the ability to create drum tracks in that keyboard and then go in and change the volume of the specific sounds individually. That was a really big deal to me. So that's one of the reasons that I love that keyboard, is because of the ARX cards. All right, now the RPS mode is the number 2 reason. Now this is kind of weird, I guess. When I bought that keyboard, now the RPS mode is the reason that I bought the keyboard back the times after I sold it. So when I first got the keyboard, I knew about the RPS mode, but it didn't trigger in my mind that I could utilize a sequencer in the same sense that the pattern sequencer would be, like I mentioned on the Motif. So I had a Phantom G and I learned about the pattern mode on the Motif XF. And so I sold my Phantom so I could buy the Motif. But I didn't even realize, like I said, I did not realize that the Phantom had a mode very similar where you could record clips or record sections of songs or sections of instruments and then place them in a sequence and allow them to loop over and over on their own. So once I learned about that, I was just like, man, I should have kept that keyboard. So I did buy it again to learn about the feature, to utilize the feature, and I thought that was something really cool that Roland had in there. I wasn't using computers for sequencing then and making tracks like I do now. I was doing a lot of stuff in the keyboard. So those sequencers, those onboard sequencers were really important to me. And having the ability to record clips or patterns and then build my songs based on those clips or patterns, that was a big deal. So that was another reason that I really liked the Phantom G, because of the RPS mode and ability to utilize clips and recording patterns to create and build your songs. Okay, now this third reason that I really like the Phantom G is something really cool as well. So the Phantom G has something inside of the keyboard called an external mixer. And what that external mixer allowed you to do was it allowed you to access external MIDI devices with the mixer in the keyboard. So the faders that were on the Phantom, I could use those faders to control the volume of external sound modules. So if you really think about that, that is kind of crazy. And it didn't require a lot of programming either. It was just as simple as you connect a MIDI controller to the Phantom and assign the MIDI channel to the fader. And now I can build even bigger sounds, even more complex layers, and not have to worry about polyphony because I'm using external sound modules, but I could control them all from right there on the front panel of the Phantom G using the sliders that were on the keyboard. And everybody knows that, you know, in church, using sliders and faders, that is like super, super important. And also layering is super, super important. So being able to take a sound module or another keyboard, not just a sound module, you could also take another keyboard and you connect that keyboard via MIDI to the Phantom, and I can play the keys on the Phantom, but it will be triggering sounds from the external keyboard. And I don't have to reach up and turn the volume down or up on the keyboard. The secondary keyboard, I can do it all from the faders on the Phantom as if the sound that I'm triggering is built into the keyboard. So I thought that was really cool. And that was one thing that I really did miss as well about selling that keyboard, was the fact of being able to access the external mixer that was built into the keyboard. Now I will say, and I do have a video about this on my channel. I will put that in the cards as well for you guys that want to see it. But the Motif does have this ability as well. It's a bit more complex, but it does work. You have to use Master Mode, and Master Mode allows you to go in and you can program the Master Mode set to access external sounds and then external MIDI sounds, and then or external MIDI keyboards or sound modules, and then you assign those channels to the faders in the keyboard. And now within Master Mode of the Motif, you can control those sounds and utilize the faders as well. So like I said, I will put a link to that video in the cards. It'll be up here on one of these sides, but if you guys want to check that out, for you Motif lovers, if there are any out there, you can check that out, and it probably will help you out quite a bit. All right, that's it for the things that I liked about the Phantom G. Now, the one thing that I didn't like about the Phantom G was it's kind of it's a personal thing, but I think it would have been really cool. One of the things that people loved about the Phantom G was the screen. That screen was just great. It was huge, very vibrant, very colorful. There was a lot of real estate in it. And what I think would have been really cool about that is if they had made that screen touchscreen. If they would have put a touchscreen in the Phantom G, I think that would have been absolute crazy. But again, that's just a personal preference, not anything wrong with the keyboard. Roland has since added touch screen to their keyboards, and I think it's a great thing that they've added. So that's just I was trying to be nitpicky and find something that I didn't like about it, and the way I use the keyboard, that was the only thing that I could really find. So that's it for number 3. My number 3 favorite Rompler keyboard of all time was the Phantom G, and now we will move on to number 2. All right, guys, so my number 2 favorite Rompler keyboard of all time may come as a little bit of a surprise, but this keyboard I still own and have had it a long time as well. I vowed never to sell it, but I have gotten really close to it, especially lately, because there's some other things that I want to get my hands on. But I just, for some reason, can't let it go. And that keyboard is the Korg M3. Now, I know you may be shocked. To me, this is a very slept on keyboard. You just don't hear a lot about it. You don't see it all over the place. You don't see people talking about it, but whenever I'm watching television and I see this keyboard on stage, I get excited because I'm like, oh, they know what they have. And that the keyboard is just, it's crazy to me for what it is and where it sat in the tier as far as Korg's keyboards were concerned. I found out recently that it was never considered the flagship because at the time it came out, the Oasis was available. So to me, I thought it was top end, but it is definitely something worth checking out. If you've never considered it or don't know a lot about it, you should definitely look into Korg M3. The reasons why I think this keyboard was so awesome. Okay, the keyboard was able to be detached from the brain. So the keyboard consists of two sections. There was the top section that had all of the interface and controls on it, the faders, the screen, the connections, all of that. And then the part it connected to was the keybed. Now, where they got this idea, I don't know, but it was brilliant in my opinion. Because what it allowed you to do is, and the keyboard comes in a 61 key, a 73 key, not 76, 73 key, 88 key, and then you could buy the brain, the M3M, by itself. All right, so what was so crazy about this thing being able to be detached from the keybed was that if you did a lot of your programming at home and you had just another cheaper MIDI controller that you liked how the keys felt, whether it be 61 key, 76 key, or just like even like the, not even like full-fledged keyboards, but just like computer MIDI controllers, as long as they had a MIDI out, you could connect that device to the brain and it was just like you had the full keyboard the whole time. Like I said, I don't know where they got the idea from, but that was very brilliant to come up with that. And it was not hard to detach. As long as you knew how to do the little screws on the hardware and get it to seat it back in place once you were finished. You could also raise, because of this detachable feature, you could also raise and lower the keybed, not the keybed, but the brain, so it could be at a comfortable viewing distance or angle while you're playing the keyboard. To me, that was crazy. I can't tell you how many times I bought M3 keyboards and kept the brain and sold the keybed, or kept the keybed and sold the brain. I've had the 73 key one, the 61 key one, the 88 key one, in all various forms, and gotten rid of different parts at different times for different reasons. But I just thought that was a really, really unique feature, and just the ability to take that brain away and utilize it somewhere else outside of the keyboard, whether it could become a desktop sound module connected to your keyboard, and you could do sequencer from it. There was just so many things, and that leads me to the number two thing that made this my number two favorite Rompler of all time. There was a lot of power packed in that little small brain. I always used to refer to it as it was small enough for me to carry in my arm like a football or like a baby. It's super small, but there was so much built into it. And like, just for example, you have a touch screen. The touch screen had vector control. If you don't know what vector control is, I have a video about vector control and how we can utilize that on the Nautilus and the Chronos. But it was built into the M3 way back then. Being able to control parameters on an XY basis using the touch screen, just incredible feature. Then you also have the sampler that's built into it. You could expand the sample memory by purchasing the RAM for the keyboard. You don't really hear a lot about the sample RAM for the M3, but that was also available, so you could load samples or user samples into the keyboard. So there's a sampler there. You got 8 faders. You have the drum pads that are on there. There's 8 of those. There's 8 drum pads that you can utilize. And then you have Karma, which is just a whole I mean, we could do a whole separate video on Karma and its abilities as far as creating backing tracks or backing accompaniment for your keyboard while you're playing it. Then you've got, you know, the ability, which is the next thing that I wanted to talk about that was a favorite, the radius card. Being able to add the radius card, and that's the last thing that was a favorite thing about this keyboard for me, was the radius card. And it's like a 20 voice or 24 voice like analog modeled synth expansion card that you could put into the keyboard, and it's got it, like I said, it's got its own voices, its own polyphony that expands the M3. I think the M3 alone is like 120 voice polyphony, but then you add this radius card, and now you got all these synth sounds and lead sounds and synth bass sounds and just all kind of textures and pads and stuff that you can create with the card, and the polyphony is separate from the rest of the keyboard. So there you are again, you know, just ability to expand a sound palette with expansion and not have to utilize the polyphony on the onboard keyboard. I guess so, you know, through this you guys are kind of seeing what's important to me. I liked pattern sequencers, clip-based sequencers. I like a lot of polyphony, and I like being able to expand the polyphony with something outside on the keyboard. So it's just an incredible device, and like I said, all of that stuff that I just said in a detachable unit that is small enough to hold and walk with in your arms. There's like little bitty cases that you can get, not from Korg, but little third-party cases. I mean, it just makes stuff so easy. And just having to be able to carry that instead of an entire keyboard, or that and a small MIDI controller instead of an entire keyboard, that made that thing very, very beneficial to me. I used to take it with just the brain to church with me, and would connect it to the digital piano that was at the church, and would just play the M3 like I was playing the M3, but all I had was the module. I mean, there's like a wealth of things that you could do with it, but that thing has been very important to me as well. That's why it made my top 3. It made top 2. I'm sure that's surprising to a lot of people. The people close to me know that, you know, I used to call the M3 my secret weapon. It's just too much under the hood for the price point that you could get it at then, and even considering that it's even cheaper to get now. The M3 is an incredible value for the money. So you might better go out and get you one before you can't find them anymore. So that's number 2, the Korg M3. All right, and the one thing about the M3 that I didn't like was it was just impossible to keep clean. It's white. You don't see a lot of white keyboards, but it was like a fingerprint magnet. And this is coming from someone that owned a Korg Triton, and those were also very hard to keep clean. They were silver. And I mean, you just have to be really careful. Grimy hands, things like that, that would otherwise not show up on a black keyboard or something like that. You had to be really careful with the M3 and, you know, keep it clean. You couldn't let dust settle. I used to clean it with, I think I would clean the surface with, I would take dish detergent, some warm water, some rubbing alcohol, and a t-shirt, and that's what I would use to clean the surface with, and it worked well. Crazy, because I like ripped so many t-shirts just from the rubbing. I don't know what caused that to happen, but that's the thing that I didn't like the most about it. It was just hard to keep clean. So just be really careful with that, and that's something to know about. But that was one of the things that I didn't like about it, was just how hard it was to keep clean, and that's just being nitpicky. I've done pretty good with mine. They just sit in my studio and they don't have to do a lot of moving around. So, but at one point I was taking it around, just had to be really careful with it. So that's what I don't like about it, and you know, all the things that I do and why I love it. So that's number 2, the Korg M3. All right, and now the number 1 Rompler of all time for me, as far as keyboards that I've owned. I'm sure this is going to be an easy guess for everybody, but it is the Korg Chronos. I think Chronos is king. I think Chronos was way ahead of its time. I don't think to this point anything really comes close as far as the sonic potential, and the sonic potential is really the basis of all of the reasons why I like the Chronos. Just all of those engines underneath the hood. It is a synth programmer or a keyboard programmer's dream to have all of that under the hood at one time in one place. Acoustic piano, electric piano, the Mod 7, the organ, the MS-20, the Poly 6, the string machine is what I call it, but the string engine, just the normal Rompler part, just the normal Rompler engine is in there as well. And I mean, there's not anything that you can't create. Like if you're into mono synths, if you're into organs, if you're into pianos, if you're into EPs, there's just so much stuff, and you can process it all by the effects that are in there, effects that are in the keyboard. The sonic potential, that's something that I've always said about the Chronos. I think it has the most sonic potential of any of the keyboards, Rompler versions, that are out there. But sonic potential, like I said, is the basis of the reasons that I'm giving for the Chronos. All right, so we talked about the engines and the sonic potential of the engines, but then also you have to consider sonic potential as it relates to the sample streaming, which is something that Korg, this is the first keyboard that they put that in. I don't know if it's in any other keyboards, but it allows you to have several gigabytes worth of samples at your fingertips and accessible, because the way the engine is set up is that it only loads the attack of the sample. So just a small portion of the sample versus it loading the entire sample into memory. It only loads the attack portion or the beginning of the sample into memory, and then it streams the rest of it from the hard drive. So if you just think about that, like if you've got 3 gigabytes, which is what we had accessible to us, 3 gigabytes worth of sample RAM, if you were, loading a 3 gigabyte library into the piano library or a 2 gigabyte piano library into the keyboard, you're going to run out of sample space quick. But if it only has to load the attack portions of the samples and not the entire sample, now think about how many more samples or how many more gigabytes worth of samples you can have access to at a given time. So that's a very great feature. It's also in the Nautilus. They did continue that there, and I think that's a great thing. I think more keyboard companies probably should to utilize that technology, because like I said, in church especially, guys, that's all people talk about is being able to load their own sounds, loading samples into their keyboards. So the more samples they can load, the better. And the more samples they can load quickly, the better. We also spoke about the flash RAM on the Motif, turning the keyboard on and it's all being there. The Chronos does take a little while to load, but it loads everything up at the beginning, and then you don't have to worry about that stuff at all. It's just, like I said, several gigabytes. You can put a secondary hard drive in the keyboard. You can exchange the size, make it larger. I don't remember exactly what people were saying about putting faster hard drives in the keyboard, but I do know you can exchange and put a secondary drive in there. So I have put a 30 gigabyte SSD in mine quite a few years ago. There's a video on YouTube about that too, if you're interested in adding a second hard drive to your Chronos. I'll put a link to that in the cards as well, so you can see that video. But you can put a secondary hard drive in there and put whatever you need, and you don't have to worry about I'm not gonna say you don't have to worry about running out of space, because eventually you do. Just have to be really smart about what you load and how you load it. So that also increases the sonic potential of the keyboard significantly, because of all of the libraries that are able to be loaded and accessible to you through sample streaming. All right, so like the last thing, this is not really that big of a deal, because it is a big deal to me, and it's a big deal in the Korg keyboards, but it's not only through the Chronos. You could also do this with the Triton, the M3s. A lot of their keyboards allow this, but Yamaha and Roland don't do this, at least not to my knowledge. Not for sure. I haven't gotten my hands on the new Phantom yet, but before then, I know for sure Yamaha and Roland didn't allow this, but you can overwrite the factory presets. I know people come out with these keyboards and they say, we've got all these sounds, we've got all these sound banks that you can use, but then they give you a small amount of user space. They have, plenty of preset programs in there, and then they give you like 2 to 4 banks worth of user slots being able to overwrite the sound. So if you have a piano sound in your Motif or your Phantom, and all you want to do is remove the reverb, you have to use an entire slot when you resave the sound, one of your user slots to save that patch. Whereas on the Chronos or any of the other, Korg keyboards prior to it, you just remove that reverb or whatever small tweak or adjustment you want to make to the sound, and then you save it. And you can save it back to the factory slot. So that increases the amount of spaces significantly that you have, because now you can use those user slots to create sounds from scratch, or sounds that you're making major changes to that aren't anything like the original sound. But just being able to make a small tweak and having to use a user slot for that when the user slots are already minimal, I don't think that's very great for the user. So being able to overwrite the factory presets is a great tool and great feature to have. Me and a buddy of mine, Randy Jenkins, we used to talk about the fact that, or we've mentioned before, that your Chronos could be completely different than the next guy's Chronos. You could have just a full plethora of everything that you've programmed. I mean, you may have all EXI sounds, or all just regular Rompler sounds that you've completely created. Or you may have a whole MS-20, like a whole Chronos that's completely dedicated to MS-20 or Poly 6 sounds. I know that's kind of overkill, but you understand what I'm saying. You could overwrite every sound and turn your Chronos and it'd be completely different from the next person. That's really crazy when you think about it. An entire keyboard full of one type of sound, or an entire Chronos full of one sound. Like I said, that's overkill, but it's still something to think about, but because everybody doesn't allow you to overwrite those factory sounds. So even if we don't have a full keyboard full of those sounds, you could have full banks that are just dedicated to just the Poly 6, or just the MS-20, or just the Mod 7. That's pretty cool. I really like that. So, and then I will give you this last thing about the Chronos. The one thing that I think I wish Korg had done with the Chronos is expanded on their pattern sequencer. They do have the ability to record patterns. I think it's called RPPR. Yes, it's called the RPPR feature, where you can kind of go in and record patterns and use those patterns to generate sections or build songs based on those patterns. But it wasn't really the most user-friendly feature. Sometimes it seemed like it was hard to keep everything in sync, from triggering the patterns to stopping them and making sure they're all starting to stop in the same place. At least I never really figured it out, and I dug into it quite a bit. There's a video with Rich Formidoni from years ago where he was talking about the RPPR function with the Korg M3, and there hasn't been a lot of other stuff that's come out about it since then. But I mean, it's a decent feature if you're using it in a very simple manner. But that's one thing I wish they had added, was a real pattern-based sequencer that I could have utilized in the way I described earlier in the video during church. That would have took the Chronos over the top for me. But I figured out other ways to do it, utilizing the Chronos still, but I had to use outside hardware in order to make it happen. So that is the Chronos wrapped up. Chronos is my favorite keyboard of all time. There's no question about that. Everybody that knows me knows that. That's my thing. But those are my top 3 favorite keyboards and 2 honorable mention keyboards of all time as far as Romplers are concerned. I may do another video like this about the sound modules that I've had. I've also had a few of those, and there's some interesting things that I like or don't like about them as well. So anyway, I hope you guys like this video. Please like, share, subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment and let me know what your favorite Rompler or your favorite keyboard is of all time and why. If you like any of the keyboards that I mentioned, also put that there. If there's something that you think I left off, why one of these keyboards should have been my favorite, or why something that should have made it not be my favorite, something that you don't like about them, leave that in the comments too. I'd love to hear from you guys, and we could go a little deeper into this. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Have a great day. Majestic Studios, we're out.